Hi everyone, this is Instructor Hernandez, and today we will be discussing how you can revise your preliminary drafts for the final draft for essay number 1. I just want to really quickly review the steps of the writing process, which we discussed last week. Last week we went over generating ideas, and that is why you completed a brainstorm activity for essay number 1. We also discussed how to develop a tentative thesis statement and how to organize your first draft. On Monday, we had our first peer review, which is where some of you received feedback on your preliminary drafts from your classmates. And remember, you are also encouraged to meet with a tutor at the LRC so that you can receive additional feedback on your essays as well. Today, we're going to discuss how to take into consideration the responses that you received on your preliminary drafts and how to apply that feedback to revising. And we will also discuss the specific steps of editing and proofreading. So the first step in the final stage of the revision process is to consider the feedback that you've already been given on your essay. And I mentioned this at the beginning of Monday's peer review that it's best to evaluate all the comments you receive with an open mind. Sometimes we receive feedback that is helpful, and sometimes we receive feedback that is either not helpful or that we don't agree with. You don't have to necessarily apply all the feedback that you receive to revising your final draft. Instead, you want to separate the feedback into two categories. First, which comments made the most sense to you? Not only the comments that you agreed with, but the ones that helped you see your writing from a different perspective. It's also important to note any consistent feedback that you've received. So if more than one person made the same type of comment about your essay, that is definitely some feedback you want to strongly consider and apply to your revision of your draft. You also want to think about which comments can you disregard or not apply to your revision process. Sometimes we receive comments that we don't necessarily agree with, or a classmate might have their own perspective on how the draft should be written, which can differ from our own. Sometimes writing can be subjective. We all have our own styles of writing, and we all have our own ways of expressing our ideas. So if one of your classmates gave you feedback that doesn't really apply to your writing or to your essay, then you can disregard that feedback. You don't have to necessarily apply every comment that you've received. When you're revising your preliminary drafts, you want to keep in mind what are the goals for revision. So you should all be working with a polished draft already, which is why you're asked to complete a preliminary draft. So right now, your focus should be on sharpening what you already have written. It's rare, but sometimes students at this stage can decide to start all over again if they don't like their first draft, or if the feedback they received has caused them to think it might just be best to start fresh. But for the most part, you'll be working with what you've already written. It's also helpful to remember that at this stage of the writing process, you should be focusing your attention on specific aspects of your essay. And you can see some examples here on my slide. Some of you might be refining your thesis statement, or you might be strengthening your overall argument. Many of you noted that you needed to include a conclusion in your final draft. So that would be a focus for you at this stage of the writing process. But as I mentioned before, you're not starting new like you were with the preliminary draft. Most of you will just be polishing what you already have written. It's also important at this stage of the writing process to make a plan especially because you have a deadline for the final draft. So you want to make sure that you've noted that deadline, and I've actually extended the deadline for the final draft of essay number 1. The original deadline was this Friday, but I've decided to push it to Sunday, the 27th. That way I have more time to give you all feedback on your drafts. And I'm also hoping that will encourage you to meet with a tutor at the LRC before the final draft is due as well. So now that you know what the final deadline is, you can create an estimate of the time you have to revise. So taking into consideration the feedback you've received, the specific aspects of your essay that you will be focusing on during revision, you want to assess what can be realistically accomplished between now and Sunday. And once you've done that, you want to create a step-by-step plan. It might be more attainable for some of you to work a little bit on the essay each day rather than trying to revise everything in one sitting. Especially if you receive feedback that your essay needs more organization or you need to add in some more elements. You want to give yourself plenty of time to do everything that you need to do so that you have a really strong final draft. When it comes to revision, these are the most common tasks that students need to complete. And I'll talk about each of these in more detail. So the main revision tasks that you should focus on is cutting, adding, or reordering. Let's talk about cutting first. Cutting is especially helpful if you've received feedback that your essay needs more focus. A lot of times, if a student has a very long first draft, but they receive feedback that the essay needs more focus or the essay gets off topic, then they might want to look at cutting out some of the material. If you were told that some of the material in your essay is either repetitive or it's not necessarily needed, let's say that it goes off topic, then that's an indication to you that this would be a good task for you to complete. In terms of what to cut, it really depends on the feedback that you've been given on your draft. Some writers might decide to cut out specific sentences or phrases, and some might even decide to cut whole paragraphs altogether. When it comes to cutting material, though, I wouldn't necessarily get rid of all the material that you decide to omit. I would recommend copying the material that you cut on a separate Word document and saving it, just in case there's something that you decide you want to add in later or even in a future essay. In addition to cutting, adding is a common revision task. And I would recommend this if you were told that there are certain points in your essay you need to clarify or strengthen. Sometimes a preliminary draft can be underdeveloped, and what that means is the writer needs to add in more details or supporting evidence, or just something in general that can help strengthen their argument. Also, we looked at the structure of the preliminary drafts in the peer review on Monday, and we talked about how adding transitions to each paragraph can help your essay flow better. Transitions allow your reader to move through your thought process, and it helps you to go from one reason of support to the next without losing your audience. Finally, there is reordering. Reordering refers to reorganizing the material that is already in your essay to help it flow more smoothly. Sometimes a writer might need to reorder the sentences of a specific paragraph, or they might decide to reorder the sequence of their paragraphs within the essay. When it comes to reordering, I recommend to students that it might be easier to start with a blank document rather than trying to work within your existing draft. You can copy and paste and just start with a blank sheet of paper or a blank Word document. That way you can focus on the new structure of your essay. Also, if you're going to reorder the sequence of paragraphs in your essay, I would highly recommend creating an informal outline first. That way you have a map of what you want your revised essay to look like. So if we were in class today, I would have you work in small groups and discuss what your plan for revision is based on what I just went over. Since we're not meeting in person today, I would like you to pause the presentation here and go to the week 5 module on Canvas. There you will see the revision plan activity, which asks you to create a revision plan and summarize it and post that on Canvas by this Friday. So if you're able to do this now and then come back to the presentation, you can pause the video here. Or if you want to complete this at a later time, you can do that as well. Just make sure that your revision plan is posted on Canvas by the deadline. Now that you've created your plan for revision for essay number 1, let's talk about the final stages of the writing process, which are editing and proofreading. Editing refers to when we are working on very specific details of sentences, paragraphs, word choice, and punctuation. So when you are at the editing stage, you should have already worked on the structure of your essay, the revision tasks that I mentioned in the first part of the video, cutting, adding, and reordering. And now you have a draft that is almost completed that you're satisfied with. So when it comes to editing, you're looking over your essay with a very fine-tooth comb, and you're making sure that your writing is as clear as it can possibly be. I will say it can be very difficult to learn how to self-edit. Oftentimes, we don't catch our own mistakes, or we read our essay and it might seem clear to us, but then someone else could read our essay and they could be confused by a sentence construction or a choice of words that we have in our own writing. So I will say for editing, it might be useful to have someone else read your essay first and tell you what is not clear in your essay. If you receive feedback that you need to edit your paragraphs, this is something you may want to do. First, you want to ask yourself, like we did on Monday when we were looking at the preliminary drafts, does each paragraph focus on one point only? You want to make sure that each paragraph has a topic sentence, which announces the main point of that paragraph, and then that every sentence within that paragraph is related to that main point. This will help your paragraphs read much more clear. You also want to make sure that your paragraphs are flowing smoothly and you're going from one idea to the next in a way that makes sense. So again, we've discussed adding transitions between paragraphs. And if you haven't yet at this stage of the writing process, it wouldn't be a bad idea to add those in. And you can even add in transitions just to see how they sound and decide to take them out if they're not needed. We also asked ourselves these questions on Monday during our peer review. So now that you're in the final stage of the writing process, it's good to go back and review your essay again from top to bottom, just to make sure that your opening paragraph is functioning in the way that it should In other words, it's catching our reader's attention right away. And if you decided to add in a conclusion, you want to now look at your conclusion and think about whether or not it provides a satisfactory ending to your essay and it ends your argument on a strong note. In addition to editing your paragraphs, you can also edit your sentences. I would recommend editing your sentences if you receive feedback that you have either sentence fragments or run-ons. You also want to read your sentences and make sure that they're varied in terms of structure and length. If you have sentences that have very similar structure, then your essay will start to sound redundant. You also want to make sure you have a variety of shorter and longer sentences and that you're using either a short or long sentence for a specific purpose. Finally, if you have any lists or series in your essays, you want to make sure that they're in what is called parallel form. So an example of parallel form would be if you said, I like to exercise, I love running, jumping, and climbing. So as you can hear in that sentence, all of my verbs are ending in ing, running, jumping, and climbing. That's an example of parallel form. So again, if you're listing anything, some of you were listing your reasons of support in your thesis statement, for example, you want to make sure that you're using parallel form because it will help your sentences sound much smoother. The very last stage of the writing process is proofreading. And this is where it can be very helpful to have someone else read your essay for you rather than trying to proofread your own writing. There's a few different ways that you can complete the stage of proofreading. One, which is very common, is using your computer's grammar and spelling checkers. A lot of students will use the Microsoft Word program and have their grammar and spelling checked by Microsoft Word. One thing I do caution students is that these programs might not be completely accurate. So while it's good to run grammar check and spell check, I would also recommend that you have a writing tutor look over the suggested revisions that came from your computer, just to make sure that they're accurate. As I mentioned in class, you can make an appointment with a tutor at the LRC for this essay. If you would like to get feedback on your grammar and you really want assistance in the editing and proofreading stage, you can make an appointment with what's called a grammar expert at the LRC. These are tutors that specialize in grammar instruction, and they will focus specifically on the grammar of your essay. So it would be very helpful to meet with a grammar expert during this final stage of the writing process. Just keep in mind that they probably will not give you feedback on other elements of your essay, like the structure and organization. So it's good for you to make sure that your essay is organized well before you meet with a grammar expert. And finally, if you have a friend or family member or a classmate that is a strong writer, then you can also ask them to read over your essay and to just give you feedback on whether or not your writing is clear, and if it's not, which areas can be improved. I wouldn't necessarily recommend asking a friend or classmate to make edits on your essay. Instead, I would ask them which areas of my essay are not clear, and then meet with a tutor at the LRC that can help you revise those sections of your essay because they are the experts when it comes to that. And they can also help you learn how to self-edit and understand why certain parts of your essay are not as clear as they should be. So once again, make sure that you complete the revision plan that is under the week 5 module on Canvas, and that is due this Friday, the 25th. And then your final draft for essay number 1 will be due on the 27th. I also want to point out the grading scale, which is listed in the syllabus, which you can view on Canvas as well. So here you can see the criteria for an A paper, a B paper, and so on. So this is the rubric that I will be using to assign a grade to your essays. If your paper falls under the C category, it could be a strong C. So it could be within this percentage range, 77 to 79. Or it could be in the lower range of 70 to 73. The score that your essay is given really depends upon how your essay fulfills this criteria that's listed here. So for instance, you can see the difference between a C paper and a B paper has to do with how the grammatical errors affect my reading of your essay. That's one of the major differences. So once again, if that's an area that you feel you could use assistance in, I would highly recommend making an appointment with a grammar expert at the LRC because they will examine the grammar in your essay and help you self-edit. And that could make the difference between a C paper and a B paper. I also want everyone to keep in mind how many points each essay is worth and the policy, the class policy on submitting late assignments. So formal essays are worth 100 points, and that refers to the final draft. The preliminary drafts were worth 25 points each. And in order for you to receive full credit, your essay must fulfill these requirements. So make sure that your essay is meeting the minimum word count. It's addressing the writing prompts, the essay instructions, and that there has been substantial revision between your preliminary draft and your final draft. If for some reason you are not able to complete your final draft on time by the deadline, you can submit it late for a grade penalty. So if you look at the section in our syllabus under submitting assignments, you can see the policy there. For your final essay draft, 10 points are deducted per day that it is late, starting on the due date. So you are highly encouraged to submit your essay on time, but if it's not finished and you need more time, you can submit it late for a grade penalty. Just make sure that it's not submitted more than 5 days late, because at that point, 50 points will have been deducted from your essay. So at the most, you will receive a 50%. And keep in mind the grade penalties for an assignment being late do not necessarily incorporate these percentages here. So after the points have been deducted for your essay being late, your essay will still be assigned a letter grade, but your final grade could end up being much lower because in addition to the letter grade that you would have received if your essay was on time, you're going to lose points for it being late. So you are highly, highly encouraged to get it done by the deadline. When you're ready to submit your essay, you can go to the Week 5 module and select Essay Number 1 Final Draft. And when you select Start Assignment, you'll be given the option to upload a file. So please keep in mind the file types that are accepted, which are listed here. And last weekend, I sent instructions on how you could convert a Google Docs to a Word document or a PDF. So make sure to read those instructions if you're not sure how to do that. And you can find those instructions here in my previous announcement. So please make sure to review those because your essay has to be submitted in the correct file type. Otherwise, I won't be able to open it and to read it. The last thing I want to review, which is what we already reviewed before your preliminary draft was due, which is MLA format. And I can add this resource on Canvas. This is the Purdue L. Remember that your textbook, the Little Seagull Handbook, also has a section on MLA format as well. So when it comes to MLA format, you want to make sure that you're following the general guidelines listed here. And you especially want to pay attention to how the first page of your essay is formatted. So you can see instructions on how to do that here, and then a sample first page of an MLA paper. Remember that you are not required to submit a works cited page with this essay, even with the final draft. So when it comes to MLA format, that just refers to the general format of your essay, as well as how your quotes are formatted within your essay. So I've mentioned that you should refer to some of the readings in our book, America Now, and you should be quoting from not all of the articles in chapter 2, but at least some of them. And when you're using a direct quote from one of those readings, you want to make sure you're including what's called an in-text citation. So here's the Purdue L resource on in-text citations. And you can also find this information in the Little Seagull Handbook as well if you go to the MLA section. For MLA format, when you're providing an in-text citation, you want to make sure you're including the author's last name as well as the page number of the quote that you are using. If you have a signal phrase before your quote that gives the author's name, so we can see an example here, then you only need to include the page number in your in-text citation. If you don't have a signal phrase that has the author's name, like this example here, then you would include the author's last name and the page number in the in-text citation. And I want to point out how in-text citations are formatted. You have the quote here in quotation marks. So this means that you are quoting word for word. The in-text citation comes after the quotation marks, and it is closed in parentheses, and then the period comes at the very end. And if you scroll down, you can see more examples here. So we are using a print source. Even though you have an electronic version of the textbook, you can cite it as a print source with a known author. Something to keep in mind about America Now, which I will go to. America Now is what is referred to as an anthology. An anthology is a collection of readings by different authors. However, an anthology should have an editor, and in this case, the editor is Robert Atwan, who is listed here on the front cover. So unless you're providing a quote from the introduction, which he wrote, in your in-text citation, you want to cite the specific author of the article that you're using. So if we look at chapter 2, for instance, the first reading, There Are No Good Alternatives to Free Speech on Campus, was written by Wendy M. Williams and Stephen J. Ceci. So if you're quoting from this reading, Williams and Ceci would be the authors' names that would go in your in-text citation. And then the page number would be the page that the quote appears on. So let's say you're quoting from this paragraph here. We can see that's on page 80. So your in-text citation should be Williams and Ceci 80. So I would refer to this source here on the Purdue L as well as your handbook, the Little Seagull handbook. Some students might use an online citation generator. And with those, I would just caution that they are not always accurate. So if you use an online source to cite in your essay, I would come back to the Purdue L and double check and make sure that those citations are correct. So once again, we are wrapping up week 5. The final draft is due on Sunday. I also originally had discussion post number 3 due this week, but this class already completed discussion post number 3 a couple of weeks ago. If you completed discussion post number 3, you don't need to post again, but I would like you to review the readings that are listed here in America Now, because we will be discussing those when we're back in class on Monday. If you didn't already post in discussion post number 3, then you are welcome to do that now. So as you can see, on Monday, starting in week 6, we'll be moving on to our next topic for essay number 2, which is the news media. So in addition to completing essay number 1, make sure that you review these readings on the news media as well. As always, if you have any questions about the class or anything that I went over in this video lecture, please send me a message on Canvas or send me an email. I will make sure to give everyone feedback on their preliminary drafts by the end of the week. And remember, you can also see a tutor at the LRC to get additional feedback as well. Good luck with your final drafts. I look forward to reading them, and I will see you all back in class on Monday.